Welcome to On Air with Kash. Our guest today is the writer and director of the new feature film Ted Bundy, American Boogeyman, starring Chad Michael Murray and Holland Roden, available on digital platforms on September 3rd. Please welcome Daniel Farrands.
Hello, guys. Hello. I appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for, oh my gosh, Daniel, it's an honor to have you on. I got to get something off my chest. You were actually responsible for getting me into the Halloween franchise because Myers, that was one of those movies. Me and my friends were up late and it was kind of like, ooh, we're going to like sneak and watch this horror movie. I think I was like 10. And that was my first introduction into the Halloween universe and became a fan. So thank you for that.
Wow. And now I feel incredibly old. So thank you for that. Thank you. No, that's very kind. Thank you. I appreciate that.
So I just saw Ted Bundy, American Boogeyman. All your films they're very entertaining. They're very thought-provoking. What I did specifically like about this, I've seen other movies and other portrayals, which were great portrayals of Ted Bundy. But I guess what I'm saying is in previous stories about Ted Bundy, it's always kind of showing his psyche or misunderstood Ted Bundy or how he used his charm. And with this, it was really a story about the victims and about the law enforcement to bring him down.
Yeah. No, thank you for saying that, number one, because that's exactly what I was going for. I really didn't want to make a movie that, like you said, sort of tells the misunderstood poor Ted story. I certainly didn't want to put this monster up on a pedestal because he was a monster. He was the boogeyman of my childhood in a sense. This man was roaming the highways of America, murdering young girls and women and feeling nothing about it. And the tragedy of all of that and the lives that he affected. And also, the law enforcement that was working against time, but also against the fact there was no technology like we have today to support their efforts. So like there's a scene in the movie where she's talking about, we've had 40,000 VWs. We know this guy's probably driving around in an old, VW Bug, but we've got 40,000 of those, but we've narrowed the list down and they're all on little index cards. They had to go through this stuff by hand. There's no database. The only computer, as McChesney says in the film, was in the payroll department, and that's all true.
It was very accurate, telling the story about Kathleen McChesney, who was wanting to join the FBI.
Yeah.
Holland Roden, who's an incredible actress. She was brilliant in this particular performance. Just her struggle, her ambition to go after and take Ted Bundy down, because that was the thing I kept thinking of and have to remind myself of. This is the 1970s. There's forensics, but there wasn't the DNA knowledge that we know. We didn't have we didn't have the internet.
It was all by hand, it was all manual labor, and I think with Holland's character in particular, she was one of the first to kind of think about the psychology of these killers, as opposed to let's just detect the clues on the scene. Let's see who is this person? Why is he doing this? What is his motivation beyond the obvious? And she's the one that put together the idea that he looked at these girls with this kind of brownish hair parted in the middle, like that was his fetish. And she understood that he was focusing on a specific type of young woman. And the fact that he was smart enough, not that Bundy was incredibly intelligent, he just was smart enough to understand that if I portray myself a certain way and prey on these kind women's sensibilities and sensitivity, I can get them to do whatever I want, and that's how he would lure them into his traps by, putting on a fake cast or walking around with crutches. That's the most terrifying part of it, is that he knew how to prey on he saw their sensitivity as a weakness, and he used that to exploit these women. And it's just horrifying.
Oh, that it is. And it was so perfectly done in this movie. And as I was saying, with other portrayals of Ted Bundy, it's exploring his psyche, being misunderstood. It takes away from the victims. I'm talking about in previous stories about Ted Bundy, where he's there, he's charming, and you're like, oh, did he? Or a thing that I commonly hear about in these documentaries is when you listen to some of these interviews that he gave, could he have really done it? And that's right. And that's where
he enjoyed the media. He enjoyed manipulating the media. He enjoyed the attention. I think a malignant narcissist like Ted Bundy enjoys the attention that's lavished upon him. I think he would enjoy the fact that this movie exists, and that bothers me to a certain extent. But I know that the reason I made it wasn't to let in on this psychopath. It was to say, here are all the people whose lives were forever changed, and also here are the people who invented the path that we now are on. in order to detect these people before they become like another Ted Bundy. I mean, it's interesting. I did show the film to the real McChesney a few weeks ago, and she really liked it. And she said, "Wait, man, I'm like a superhero." But I mean, she was lovely, and she understood, and she agreed that way. I think, and one of the acknowledgments that I got from her that really meant a lot was the fact that she's like, "You really tapped into and portrayed that struggle that we felt, you know, that almost like that hopelessness at some times, at moments in this case where when he escaped, or when they shut down the task force because now it was a bigger case. You know, there was that sense of kind of defeat that we all, and she's like, the movie really captures what we went through as a team, but also just her personal stake in it, being a woman of the age that at the time, you know, she could have easily been one of his victims, and she understood, you know, the pain and the suffering that these families went through. So, and she really was kind of like, you know, she kind of gave voice to those victims. And it was something very important to me for this movie to do, is to keep saying their names, you know, to keep saying those girls' names, for her to kind of give voice to them, but be almost like you know, an activist for them. You know, they couldn't speak for themselves, but she was the one fighting for them and for justice for them.
Oh, that was so beautifully put. What you said, here's the hero of your movie. The real person sees it, loves your work. And it does everything that you just said about, as far as her showing her struggle, it's telling her story, and everything that she did back in the 1970s. It's just for her to like get this kind of a national acknowledgement in a feature film, and her portrayal and her struggle. I mean, wow, no, that's an incredible story.
It was really, you know, again, she wasn't creatively involved in the film, but the fact that she saw it and she saw what we were doing, what our intentions were, that really meant everything. So any critic that comes along and says this and that and the other, I don't care, because the real person that this is showing, depicting, and portraying, it means something to her, and she understood it.
I couldn't have said that better. That was perfect.
Yeah,
oh
no, but she really was just very gracious about the whole thing, and encouraging. And she really felt like, you guys, she's like, you know, you really tapped into something, and I think that you paid respect to the victims, and that's all we really could ask. You know, we'll never bring them back, unfortunately, and the pain that the families have endured all these years can't be lessened. But I do feel like, in a way, by telling this version of the story, we get to see a little bit more of that, and hopefully we understand and have more compassion. And you know, honestly, one of the things that bothers me is that I feel like we're living in a time where people don't care about each other. And I feel like, in a way, as violent as all of this is, it's almost like a reminder, like, we got to look out for each other here. You know, this life is precious and life is short. And there are wolves in sheep's clothing around us all the time, and we just have to look out for each other.
Oh, absolutely. Well, but I couldn't agree with you more. I just look at what's happening in the world. And I mean, even just I know this past year and a half has been so hard on all of us. And it's just really made me reflect. I mean, one of my things is I journal every day, and just whatever's floating in my head that I have to acknowledge, that I have to work on. And then just even when I go out, it's really made me question or put myself in check, like, you know, what could I do to make the world a better place, even just in my everyday life.
But it's just not, you know, and I think there's an apathy, in a way, to violence, you know, and I look, and it's so sad, you know, like in those days, you know, we were afraid of a Ted Bundy. Now it's like you're afraid to go into a Walmart or a high school, you know, and where people just will shoot you. And just the level of violence in this country is just so out of hand, you know. And I feel like, in a way, Ted Bundy was like a warning for everything that happened later, you know, where we as a society.
And one of my favorite shows is Forensic Files. I love how they were watching people put together a case, even a 30-year-old case that didn't have the DNA evidence. And
for sure,
a scene that really stuck out for me in the movie was the way that, and again, like I had mentioned, in previous incarnations, you have kind of Ted Bundy being charming, and you're like, oh, that's how he was able to lure his victims. But there's that, without giving spoilers away or mild spoiler alert, there's a scene where Ted Bundy is about to commit an act. It takes place outside of a mall involving a car and him posing as a security. That's all I'll say about the movie itself. But just the nature and how he was, the hints that he was picking up on to manipulate the victim that he was preying on, and then how he lures. You showed how the victim felt. Like, it's still, okay, it sounds legit, but he's still creepy. There's something about this guy. And you remind the viewer in that even when he goes to Florida, when he's renting that room, there's still something about him. It's not like he's the charming guy everybody likes.
Absolutely.
We didn't think so. It was like, no, there's something off about this guy, and you really did a great job of addressing that.
Because that was important as well. I think, a lot of, like, again, I'm not to impugn anybody else's depiction of Bundy. I think there have been some really good movies and excellent documentaries made about him. I just didn't want to show that side because I didn't believe that. I believe that, while he might have been modestly good looking and reasonably intelligent, I feel like there was something weird about him that these women were smart enough to pick up on. There were a number of women who walked away from him or ran away from him because the way he approached them. It was the ones where he really was able to kind of use, again, like you bring up the example of the woman at the mall who, had her wits about her and really second guessed her decision to go with him, but he really came off as kind of legit. It wasn't until she got into the car and she saw like it was this big mess with wrappers and, empty bottles of, gin on the floor that she's like, oh yeah, no, this isn't good. So yeah, I mean, I think there wasn't a slight awareness. Well, maybe not slight. I think it was a very pronounced awareness from the women who were able to get away from him, and there were not many. But, and I think we used the element of surprise. It wasn't always he was just lure them and try to charm them. He'd just sneak up behind them at some, in an alley or whatever. I mean, that's what was so diabolical about him and so scary. And I think it's part of the reason we still talk about him and why we're still kind of ruminating on this story. I mean, there's been lots and lots of serial killers, but this one was different because he seemed like one of us. He blended in, and that was part of the, I think just the evil that was Ted Bundy. I think that's what was so off-putting and terrifying about him, was that he knew how to blend in.
It was so eerie too. And Chad Michael Murray, who I've actually, one of my first jobs out in LA was in voiceover, and I got to work with Chad.
I can see.
Thank you. Yes, now I got the setup, and so yeah. No, I appreciate that. So Chad, I met him twice earlier. This is going back maybe 10 years. And we worked together, and he was just so humble, so cool. And I grew up watching him like Freaky Fridays. He was so, in all these shows growing up, and just even a lot of the roles that he's had now with Riverdale. And then you have Ted Bundy. The way that he portrayed Ted Bundy in this, and I know what you used as the narration in his head were actual recordings of Ted Bundy's interviews, and it was just so eerie, and it was just such an intense performance. And then just visually directing the cinematography, it was really appreciate what you all did.
It wasn't easy. We made this movie on a small budget at the beginning of COVID. A lot of the money that we would have had to do other things that I would love to have done with it, went to testing our cast and crew to keep everybody safe. It was just a different experience of making a movie, and we really kind of were leading the charge in a way for the continuation of film production. And luckily we think we all came out of it unscathed. Fortunately, nobody contracted COVID, and we were all very safe. And I think the money was well spent, and I'm glad that we did it. But yeah, it added a whole other set of challenges for sure. But yeah, no, Chad's performance in this is pretty remarkable, and he kind of goes through this weird transformation as the movie goes on. It just gets eerier and eerier, and you can see where he's kind of like losing his sense of reality, becomes even more fractured as it continues. And it all culminates in this sort of night of horror that he, unfortunately exacted on these sorority girls in Florida. It's just horrifying, horrible.
Yes, it is. I mean, and those intense scenes that build up, everything about just Chad's arrival everything about Ted Bundy's arrival into Florida, how he talks to the den mother, relationships, I should say, he's attempting to have with the students there, and then just to see where it ends up, how he gets apprehended. My goodness, I was at the edge of my seat.
I didn't have to reach too far to make it scary, because it's absolutely fucking horrifying. Everything that happened. It's like the more I delved into it and the more I was reading, like, this couldn't have really happened. And then, you realize how much reality there was to this. Everything that is depicted in the movie is not an exaggeration of what he did. In fact, it's really downplayed, the level of violence. And I really wanted to, in a way, like in those scenes where he's killing and he's, doing unspeakable things to these victims, I really wanted to, in a way, distance the audience from those specific acts, because I just feel like that's not what this movie's about. It's so I used this kind of like trick in the lens. It was all very distorted kind of vision, and it's almost like I just wanted to give a bit of a space between the violence and the audience's participation in the movie. It's not a slasher film where you're kind of cheering on Michael Myers or Jason. That's not what this is. So I was very conscious and very careful about how we depicted it.
And I totally got that. It was an accurate portrayal of a very dark character. And I know that what you had just mentioned about filming this during the pandemic, you didn't only film this movie, but we have American Boogeywoman coming out very soon as well,
right?
too. So yeah, you did too during the pandemic.
I know. I was a glutton for punishment, man. But part of it maybe was, we just were kind of all, stir crazy. And I think being able to go out and tell stories and make something at such a difficult time, and then obviously telling such difficult stories, I think were, added to the, kind of heaviness of it all. But the Eileen Wuornos American Boogeywoman, which comes out on September 20th, it's very tonally very different from the American Boogeyman movie. I mean, it plays more of like a what if, kind of a film noir kind of take on that. It's not a remake of Monster, which nobody can hold a candle to what that movie was, and that Charlize Theron played so beautifully. But it is a different chapter of Eileen Wuornos's very tragic life and how she perceived it. It's kind of seen through her kind of fractured memories of a chapter of her life that, honestly, I think she played her cards differently. If she had the emotional stability to maintain it, she probably could have lived a very, very different and very privileged life. So it's quite an interesting story.
Yeah, and I have heard just what you said about how she was married before and how she could have had that privileged life.
Yeah.
And and of course the Charlize Theron, the monster, with Christina Ricci as well. Brilliant,
so
masterpiece, award-winning. Yeah, I am really curious about these earlier years, and Paintless, incredible. You've worked with a lot of my friends, so I'm real like Swen Temmel. He was on the show recently.
Oh,
he plays Grady. And we talked a bit about it when he was wrapping another movie. He mentioned it. And Kristen Collins. Yeah.
So great. God, she's a scene stealer in one moment.
Oh, good. It's funny. We were just texting the other day about something. When I looked, I'm like, Kristen, I didn't know she was in it, but yeah, she did one of my first films with me, and called Jack and Cocaine, and she did the soundtrack for that. I've been in her music videos. So
musician and her husband, they can do everything.
Those woolly bandits, they can do it all.
Absolutely. So it's funny. It's such a small world, but no, absolutely. We'll have to talk again after that comes out, and so I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Oh, I'd be honored to. And lastly, I do got to say, I recently saw The Murder of Nicole Brown Simpson, another one of your films, and I was actually just curious. And for me, I mean, I'll just full disclosure. I mean, I grew up in LA, and that was like the whole OJ thing. It was. For me, it was really bizarre because I'm a little kid, and I think my mom was working on the third Naked Gun movie, so I got to go with my mom to work, and they asked me if I wanted to. My scene got cut, but there's a scene early in the movie where Leslie Nielsen, he's having a flashback. There's a robbery in the grocery store, so you can see my mom, but you could just see my spiky little mullet floating in the background. But I was a little bummed that I got cut. But we went to the premiere. At the beginning, there's this parody of The Untouchables, and OJ's catching the children and doing the Heisman dance, and my mom's like, OJ, he was a football star, and then 2 months later, it's all over the news, and not only that, but my dad grew up with Kardashian Sr., and Robert Shapiro's son is going to our school, so it was everywhere. It was just so like,
that's
and that was like one of my first. And that was like the first movie I was in, so it's always been this weird.
Oh wow! It's not even 6 degrees. It's like 1 degree for you removed. And I think if you live in Los Angeles, I lived here as well. In fact, I remember I was writing Halloween 6 when the Bronco chase happened on the freeway. Like I remember like looking up from the computer that I had at the time, some DOS computer, writing the script and looking over the TV and seeing OJ's white Bronco, being chased down the 405. It's just crazy. Again, this tragic story. And, that was a script that kind of came to me kind of pre-done. So it wasn't entirely my, idea to do that. But there's moments in that movie that really saddened me. When she turns to Kris Kardashian and she says, if anything happens to me, I need you to promise you'll look after my children. It's like she knew kind of something was going to happen. She understood that. I don't know. It honestly, like just talking about it, like it actually like makes my heart speed up a little bit, because I feel like she was a good mother, and I felt like she was manipulated again, by a powerful man who, knew her weaknesses and used his strength, his physical strength, and his money to, control her. And I think that's part of what that story was. Whether or not she met this Glenn Rogers, this serial, there's speculation about it. And I think that was kind of interesting about the script was, that she apparently hired this guy to renovate or paint her house. And here he was like this, call it like this serial killer that was going around like kind of Ted Bundy, like murdering women. Mm-hmm. What are the chances of that? I don't, and it's funny how people said like this movie was supposed to let OJ off the hook. I mean, it never says that at all. I
never got that either. And again, I mean, I grew up around it, knew the case very well. So yeah, I totally got where just cinematically what the story was going for. But
yeah, they're like, how did she's floating on the ceiling. I'm like, it was a dream.
Yeah.
It was a dream. So it's just funny how people fixate on certain things and don't see the bigger picture, just want to see what they want to see. But that movie to me was never about exonerating O.J. Simpson. It was, in fact, sort of the opposite. It was to say, here's this woman and she's surrounded by madness, yes. Chance. And whether or not it was the serial killer that she may or may not have met or had a dalliance with or whatever, we don't know. But it was kind of an interesting what if. But just to say that she was surrounded by this evil, that ultimately cost her and this other young innocent man his life, who just tried to help her. So I just thought the movie, I think the take on it was interesting from that perspective. But again, a lot of people just kind of heaped on the criticism because, here was telling a story that made people uncomfortable.
Right. Really. I mean, I grew up, like I said, during that time, and it was really one of my first images was just OJ and the whole thing. So for me, and I totally understood, like it was an interesting thing to examine, and and I enjoyed it.
And it was not trying to reinvent or let anybody off the hook or say this is the way it really happened. It's funny how people just jump to these conclusions. People, they just don't read between the lines anymore. Everything needs to be like in your face, pointed out, said to be. There's no people like subtlety and subtext don't mean much anymore. I've come to realize in storytelling. People want it all kind of spelled out. Not everyone, but there are, there's a segment, especially the ones that get very vocal, we'll call them the internet trolls, who love to kind of heap on, negativity on things without sort of looking at the bigger picture.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. And I'm someone who I like to read between the lines, and I like content that makes me think. And you've done it with pretty much every movie I've ever seen, whether it was Ted Bundy, Nicole Brown Simpson. I'm stoked for American Boogie Woman. Whenever I watch one of your movies, and then I want to go and further examine the subject and go back to certain things. So it's you give me something to think about.
Good. Well, no, I mean, honestly, and I do. That's a great compliment, and I'm not trying to take credit for any of that, honestly, because if the end result is that these movies make people want to go learn about the story behind it, I feel like that's a job well done then, because again, I feel like we should never blot out history. We should never, the good, the bad, the ugly, all of it. We need to remember it and we need to document it so that we don't repeat the mistakes of the past. And we don't fall into some of these traps. And again, with movies like a Ted Bundy, my takeaway for me was we need to be better to each other. We need to be more mindful. We need to be more protective.
You said it, Daniel. I can't thank you enough for your time.
Oh, thank you.
Talking with us today. And no, this was just such really just I have so much admiration for you as a writer, as a producer, as a filmmaker. And everyone, on September 3rd, you have got to watch Ted Bundy, American Boogeyman, starring Chad Michael Murray and Holland Roden. It'll be available on all digital platforms. And on September 20th, get ready for American Boogie Woman, directed by this man, the great Daniel Farrands. Daniel, I can't thank you enough for your time again. And really, I'm pumped. I want to talk to you again when American Boogie Woman comes out.
Let's stay in touch. Thank you again. I appreciate it. You take care of yourself. Stay safe.
You too, sir. Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you so much for rocking out with me and Daniel Farrands today. You are on air with Kash.